A week after my husband died, my daughter gave my room to someone else, and expected me to thank her for it. I didn't say anything when I first saw the door open. I just stood there in the hallway, my hand still resting on the wooden frame like I had forgotten why I came upstairs in the first place. The house smelled different that morning. Not like the faint cedar and aftershave that used to linger in the air, but something sharper, unfamiliar. A stranger's cologne. For a moment, I thought I had walked into the wrong home. But the pictures on the wall were still mine. The same family portraits. The same staircase I had climbed every night for 43 years. Only now, something inside it had shifted, quietly, completely, without asking me. I pushed the door open just a little wider. My bedroom, our bedroom, was no longer mine. The bed was made, but not the way I used to make it. The pillows were arranged too stiffly, like a hotel display. My quilt, the one Edward and I bought on our anniversary trip to Vermont, was gone. In its place was a plain gray comforter I had never seen before. And sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone like he belonged there, was a man I didn't recognize. He looked up at me, surprised but not embarrassed. Not apologetic. Just mildly inconvenienced, like I had interrupted something routine. "Oh," he said, glancing toward the hallway behind me. "You must be Rebecca's mom." I didn't answer right away. My eyes moved slowly across the room, searching for something that still felt like mine. The dresser cleared. The nightstand empty. Even the small framed photo of Edward and me, the one from our 25th anniversary dinner, had disappeared. It was as if someone had carefully erased every trace of my life, one item at a time, until there was nothing left to prove I had ever belonged here. "I think there's been a mistake," I said finally, my voice quieter than I expected. The man hesitated, then stood up, brushing imaginary lint from his jeans. "Rebecca said this room was available," he replied. "She told me everything was already arranged." Already arranged. I repeated the words silently, letting them settle in the hollow space inside my chest. Arranged. Like furniture. Like a schedule. Like I was something that could be moved out of the way without notice. I nodded once, not to him but to myself. Then I stepped back and closed the door gently, as if I were afraid of disturbing something delicate. Downstairs I found Rebecca in the kitchen, pouring herself coffee like it was any other Tuesday morning. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she smiled, bright, casual, almost rehearsed. "Oh good, you're up," she said. "I was just going to come get you." I stood there for a second, studying her face. My daughter. The same girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, clutching her blanket and whispering that she felt safe next to me. The same girl who cried the day she left for college because she said she didn't know how to live without my cooking. And now she was standing in my kitchen, holding a mug I bought 15 years ago, acting like she had done me a favor. "Who is that man in my room?" I asked. She didn't flinch. "His name is Tyler," she said, stirring her coffee slowly. "He's going to be staying with us for a while." Staying with us. I let the phrase pass through me without reacting. "In my room?" I asked. Rebecca sighed like I was being difficult. "Mom, you don't need that big room anymore," she said. "It doesn't make sense for you to be up there by yourself. The guest room downstairs is much more practical. It's closer to everything." Practical. That was the word she chose. Not kind. Not temporary. Practical. I glanced toward the stairs, then back at her. "You moved my things," I said. She nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "I packed everything carefully. It's all in the closet in the guest room. Nothing's missing. Nothing's missing." I almost smiled at that, because everything was missing, just not in a way she could measure. I walked past her without another word, my footsteps soft against the tile floor. The guest room was exactly as she described. Smaller, colder, tucked away in the corner of the house like an afterthought. My clothes were folded into neat boxes. My shoes lined up against the wall. Even my jewelry had been placed in a plastic container, as if it were something temporary, something waiting to be sorted later. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around. The walls were bare. The window faced the side yard instead of the garden Edward used to take care of every morning. It felt like a place you stayed in when you had nowhere else to go. Not a place you lived. Upstairs I heard footsteps. Laughter. A door closing. life continuing just one floor above me without interruption. I rested my hands in my lap and stared at the floor for a long time. Not crying. Not angry. Just still. They thought I was too broken to notice. Too lost in grief to understand what was happening around me. They thought moving me downstairs would feel like a small change. A practical adjustment. They thought I would accept it quietly the way I had accepted everything else in my life. But sitting there in that small room, surrounded by boxes that used to be my life, I realized something they hadn't considered. I wasn't disappearing. I was being removed. And the difference between those two things was everything. I woke up the next morning to the sound of cabinets opening and closing, followed by a voice I did not recognize humming softly in the kitchen, and for a few seconds I forgot where I was, or rather, I forgot that I was no longer where I used to be, because my body still remembered the old rhythm, the way Edward would wake before me, the way he would move quietly so he would not disturb me, the way the house used to feel like it belonged to both of us instead of something I had to navigate carefully like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. And then I opened my eyes and saw the unfamiliar ceiling above me, the plain walls, the narrow window that let in a thin slice of morning light, and it all came back at once, not like a shock but like a slow settling of truth, heavy and undeniable. And I lay there for a moment longer listening, trying to understand how easily everything had continued without me, how the house had adjusted overnight as if it had been waiting for me to step aside. And when I finally sat up, the room felt smaller than it had the night before. Or maybe I had simply become more aware of its limits, the way the air did not move the same. The way the silence here was different, more contained, as if even my presence had been reduced to fit within it. And I reached for the small box beside the bed where Rebecca had placed my things, opening it slowly, not because I expected to find anything new, but because I needed to see something that still felt like mine. And inside were my bracelets, my watch, the necklace Edward gave me on our 40th anniversary. All arranged neatly, carefully, respectfully even, but without meaning, like objects stored rather than cherished. And I closed the lid gently and stood up, smoothing my robe as if I were preparing for something important, though I was not entirely sure what that something was anymore. And when I stepped into the hallway, the sound of laughter drifted up from the kitchen, light and easy, the kind of laughter that used to fill this house on holidays, and I paused at the top of the stairs, my hand resting on the railing, listening, recognizing Rebecca's voice, and then the other one, Tyler, speaking as if he had always been here, as if this arrangement had existed long before I noticed it. And I walked down slowly, each step deliberate, not because I was weak, but because I was paying attention now in a way I had not before, noticing how the house responded to me, or rather, how it did not. And when I reached the bottom, Rebecca glanced up from the stove and smiled again, that same bright, effortless smile that did not quite reach her eyes. And Tyler turned as well, holding a coffee mug, standing comfortably in a space that had once been entirely familiar to me. And for a brief second, the three of us simply stood there, as if waiting for someone else to define the moment. And then Rebecca spoke first, her tone casual, almost cheerful, asking if I had slept well, as if the question itself could smooth over what had already been done. And I nodded once, taking a seat at the small table near the window, the one Edward used to sit at when he read the newspaper, though the paper was gone now, replaced by a tablet that Tyler had left on the counter, its screen still glowing faintly. And Rebecca moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, pouring coffee, setting plates, speaking about plans for the day, about errands and schedules and small things that filled the space between larger truths. And I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I was beginning to understand something that had been hidden beneath all of this, something quieter than the words themselves. And when she placed a cup of coffee in front of me, I noticed it was not the mug I used to use, not the one Edward had bought me years ago with the small chip on the rim that I refused to throw away, but a plain white one, clean, unremarkable, interchangeable. And I wrapped my hands around it anyway, feeling the warmth, letting it anchor me in the present moment. And Tyler began to speak about his work, about how convenient the location was, how grateful he was to have found such a comfortable place on short notice. And Rebecca nodded along, adding details, reinforcing the narrative they had already built between them, one in which I did not need to be consulted, only informed. And I watched them carefully, not with anger, but with a kind of clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, because for the first time I was not trying to preserve anything, not trying to keep the peace or maintain the illusion of family harmony. I was simply observing, and what I saw was not cruelty in the way people imagine it, not raised voices or harsh words, but something quieter, something more efficient, a gradual reshaping of space and roles until I no longer fit into either. And when Tyler excused himself to take a call, stepping outside with his phone pressed to his ear, Rebecca turned back to me, her expression shifting slightly, becoming more practical, more direct, and she asked if I had found everything in the guest room, if there was anything else I needed, and I shook my head slowly, telling her that everything was exactly where she had put it, and she seemed satisfied with that, as if the order of objects equaled the resolution of the situation. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, not uncomfortable but revealing, and I realized then that she was waiting for something, perhaps a complaint, perhaps resistance, something that would confirm her expectation of how I should respond, but I did not give it to her. I simply took a sip of my coffee and looked out the window toward the garden, where the plants Edward had tended were beginning to grow unevenly, untended, reaching in different directions without guidance, and I felt something settle inside me, not resignation but recognition, because this was not a misunderstanding, not a temporary adjustment or a series of unfortunate decisions. This was a plan that had already been set in motion, a quiet restructuring of my life that had begun long before I noticed it, and now that I could see it clearly, I understood that nothing about it was accidental, and more importantly, nothing about it required my permission. It was not the big things that changed first, it was the small ones, the ones most people would not notice unless they were looking closely, and I had started looking closely not because I wanted to, but because there was nothing else left to do except observe, and over the next few days I began to see the pattern more clearly, the way the house continued to adjust around me as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved to a corner but not entirely removed, still present but no longer central, and it started with the little habits, the routines that had once defined my place in this home, like the way I used to make breakfast every morning, the way I knew exactly how Rebecca liked her eggs, soft but not runny, and how Edward preferred his toast just slightly browned, and now the kitchen belonged to someone else, not in ownership but in function because Tyler had begun waking earlier than I did, moving around confidently, using the cabinets without hesitation, placing his things where mine had once been, and one morning, I opened the drawer where I kept the measuring cups and found it rearranged, not carelessly but deliberately, as if someone had taken the time to decide what stayed and what was no longer necessary, and I closed it again without touching anything, because I understood that it was no longer about convenience, it was about control. And later that afternoon, I noticed that the thermostat had been adjusted, not to a temperature I preferred, but to one that felt slightly colder, just enough to make me aware of it, just enough to remind me that comfort was no longer something I could assume, and I wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders without saying a word, because I was beginning to see that every small change carried the same quiet message: this is no longer your space. And Rebecca never said it directly, she did not need to, because the house was saying it for her, in the way the pantry shelves had been reorganized, in the way my favorite chair in the living room was now occupied by Tyler most evenings, his laptop open, his feet resting comfortably on the ottoman Edward used to use, and I would sit on the couch instead, my hands folded in my lap, watching television programs I did not follow, not because I was interested, but because it gave me something to do while I listened to the conversations happening around me, conversations that no longer included me unless absolutely necessary, and sometimes Rebecca would ask me simple questions, polite ones, about whether I needed anything from the store or if I had taken my medication, and I would answer calmly because there was no reason not to, but beneath those exchanges, there was an absence that had not been there before, something essential that had been quietly removed, and it was not until the third evening that I understood how far it had gone, because that was when I heard them talking in the kitchen after they thought I had gone to bed, their voices low but not careful enough to be truly private, and I was not trying to listen, not at first, but the words carried through the hallway in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and I paused near the doorway, not stepping inside, just standing where the shadows kept me out of sight, and Rebecca was saying something about timing, about how it would be easier to handle things sooner rather than later, and Tyler asked a question I could not fully hear, but I caught enough of it to understand the direction of the conversation, something about the house, about space, about long-term plans, and then Rebecca said very clearly that once everything was settled, they would not have to worry about extra complications, and there was a pause after that, a silence that felt heavier than the words themselves, and I did not need her to explain what she meant because I already knew. I had known in pieces over the past few days, but hearing it spoken aloud, even indirectly, made it undeniable. This was not about helping me, Not about making things easier for me after Edward's passing. This was about simplifying their own lives by removing me from the equation, and I stood there for a moment longer, letting the realization settle, not as a sudden shock, but as something that had finally taken its full shape. And then I turned and walked back to my room without making a sound, closing the door gently behind me, and I sat on the edge of the bed again the same way I had the first night, but this time the stillness inside me felt different, not empty but focused, because I was no longer trying to understand what was happening. I understood it now, completely, and the question was no longer whether I belonged here, but what I was going to do about the fact that I did not. And for the first time since Edward died, I allowed myself to think not about what I had lost, but about what I still had, not in this house but beyond it, things I had not needed to consider before. Things that had always been there, quietly waiting, just like I had been. And as I reached for the small box beside the bed, the one Rebecca had packed so carefully, I opened it again, not to look at the jewelry this time, but to search beneath it, to feel for something else, something I had not thought about in years. And when my fingers brushed against the folded piece of paper tucked at the bottom, I paused, holding it there for a moment before pulling it out, because even before I opened it, I knew exactly what it was, and more importantly, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by them. I held the paper in my hands for a long time before unfolding it, not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I remembered exactly when Edward had given it to me, and that memory carried a weight that had nothing to do with ink or signatures. It had been a quiet afternoon 3 years ago, nothing remarkable on the surface, just sunlight filtering through the kitchen window, the kind of ordinary day that does not announce itself as important until much later. And he had been standing by the counter, unusually serious, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands as if he were choosing his words carefully. And when he finally spoke, he did not raise his voice or make it sound dramatic. He simply said that there were things I needed to know, things he had arranged, not because he expected anything to happen soon, but because he believed in being prepared. And I remember laughing softly at the time, telling him that he was always thinking too far ahead, always planning for problems that might never come. And he smiled at that, the same patient smile he had used throughout our entire marriage, the kind that never argued, never forced, just waited until I was ready to understand. And then he placed the folded document in my hand and told me to keep it somewhere safe, somewhere I would remember but not somewhere obvious. And I had done exactly that, not because I thought I would need it, but because he had asked me to. And now, sitting on the edge of a bed that did not feel like mine, I unfolded it slowly, smoothing out the creases with my fingers as if I were handling something fragile, though the paper itself was sturdy, official, the kind used for documents meant to last. And as my eyes moved across the words, the legal language felt distant at first, formal and precise in a way that required attention, but the meaning beneath it was clear, unmistakable. And as I read, I felt something shift inside me, not a sudden rush of emotion, but a steady realignment, like a compass finding its direction after being disturbed. And I read it again, more carefully this time, making sure I had not misunderstood, making sure that what I thought it meant was exactly what it meant. And when I finished, I folded it back along the same lines and held it in my lap, my hands resting lightly on top of it. And for a few moments I did nothing. I did not rush to stand or react, I simply sat there, allowing the quiet certainty to settle into place, because this was not about surprise. Edward had not believed in surprises when it came to things that mattered. This was about intention, about decisions made long before this moment, decisions that had been waiting patiently, just like the paper in my hands. And I thought about the past few days, about the small changes, the quiet conversations, the careful rearrangements that had been made without me, and I saw them differently now, not as isolated actions, but as part of a larger assumption, an assumption that I had nothing left to stand on, nothing left to claim, that my place in this house, in this life, had been defined entirely by my role as a wife, and that without Edward I was simply optional. And I let out a slow breath, not in frustration but in acknowledgement, because in a way they had been right about one thing. I had allowed myself to become quiet, to step back, to accept changes without question, not because I was weak, but because I believed that family did not require constant defense, that love created its own stability, and perhaps that had been true once. But sitting there now, with the document resting beneath my hands, I understood that stability does not come from assumption, it comes from structure, from decisions made deliberately, and Edward had understood that in a way I had not fully appreciated until this moment. And I looked around the room again, at the boxes, the neatly arranged belongings, the careful way my life had been condensed into manageable pieces, and I felt something unexpected rise within me, Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. A kind of calm that does not come from acceptance, but from knowing exactly where you stand. And I stood up slowly, walking to the small desk in the corner, placing the document flat against the surface as I read through one particular section again, tracing the lines with my finger, committing them to memory, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand every detail, every implication. And when I finished, I folded it once more and slipped it back into the box, not hidden, not forgotten, but placed with intention. And I closed the lid gently, my movements steady, deliberate, because there was no urgency in what I was about to do, no need for haste. This was not a reaction, it was a response, one that had been prepared long before I realized I would need it. And as I stepped back into the hallway, the house felt the same as it had before, the same sounds, the same movements, the same quiet assumptions continuing uninterrupted. But I was not the same person moving through it, and when I passed the staircase, I glanced upward for just a second, toward the room that had once been mine, and I did not feel the need to reclaim it, not yet, because what mattered was not the room itself, but the understanding that I had never truly lost anything that belonged to me. I had simply been waiting to remember that it was still mine to decide. I did not make the call that day or the day after because timing, I realized, was not about urgency, it was about precision. And for the first time in many years, I allowed myself to move without explaining, without announcing, without asking for permission to take up space in a life that had already begun to close in around me. And instead I watched, I listened, I let the rhythm of the house reveal itself more clearly, because once you stop trying to belong, you begin to see things exactly as they are. And what I saw over the next few days was not chaos, not cruelty in the obvious sense, but a carefully maintained structure that functioned perfectly well without me. A routine that had already adapted to my absence before I had even fully understood it. And Rebecca moved through her days with quiet efficiency, checking her phone, making lists, speaking in low, practical tones about appointments and schedules, while Tyler settled deeper into the space, leaving his shoes near the door, placing his keys in a small dish that had once held Edward's watch, as if he had always known where things belonged. And I did not interfere, not because I accepted it, but because I was beginning to understand the importance of letting things unfold completely before stepping in. And one afternoon, as I sat in the living room with a book open in my hands that I was not reading, I noticed Rebecca sorting through a stack of papers at the dining table. Her expression focused, her movements deliberate, and I watched her from across the room, not hiding my attention, but not drawing it either. And after a few minutes, she gathered the papers into a neat pile and placed them in a folder, one I did not recognize. And for a brief moment our eyes met, and she smiled again, that same practiced smile, before closing the folder and setting it aside. And I did not ask what it was, because I already knew it would not be something she intended to share. And that evening I noticed something else, something small but telling, because when I went to the kitchen to make tea, I found that the drawer where we kept important household documents, warranties, receipts, and old insurance papers had been cleared out completely, not disorganized, not messy, but emptied, as if its contents had been relocated somewhere more private, more controlled. And I closed it slowly, my fingers lingering on the handle for just a second longer than necessary, because that drawer had always been a shared space, something accessible, something neutral, and now it was gone, absorbed into whatever system Rebecca was building without me. And I returned to the living room with my tea, sitting down quietly, letting the warmth of the cup settle into my hands as I thought about what I had seen, not reacting, not confronting, just placing another piece into the pattern that had been forming all along. And later that night, as I passed by the dining table on my way back to my room, I noticed the folder again, still there, slightly open now, as if it had been handled recently. And I paused, not because I intended to invade her privacy, but because something about it felt familiar. Something about the shape, the color, the way it had been labeled. And I leaned closer, just enough to read the small printed text on the tab. And when I saw the word transfer, I did not feel surprised, I did not feel anger, I simply straightened and continued walking, because the meaning was already clear. They were not just rearranging the house, they were preparing to redefine ownership, to formalize what had already been set in motion. And as I closed the door to the guest room behind me, I sat down again, this time not on the bed, but at the small desk where I had placed the box earlier, and I opened it once more, taking out the folded document, not to read it again, but to hold it, to feel its weight in my hands, because what it represented was no longer abstract. It was no longer something tucked away for a distant possibility. It was the answer to a question that had already been asked without my consent, and I placed it on the desk, smoothing it flat, my movements steady, deliberate, and I reached for the small notepad beside it, the one I had not used in months, and I began to write, not a message, not a letter, but a single name, one that Edward had mentioned that afternoon years ago, one that I had not needed until now, and as I wrote it, I felt that same quiet realignment settle deeper within me, because this was not about reclaiming a room or correcting a misunderstanding. This was about restoring balance, about reminding those around me that absence is not the same as surrender. And when I finished, I set the pen down carefully, closing the notepad and placing it beside the document, and I sat there for a moment longer, listening to the house as it continued its quiet routine around me, unaware, unchanged. And then I reached for my phone, not with hesitation, not with anger, but with certainty, because some actions do not require preparation, only recognition of the moment when they are necessary. And I knew, as I looked at the name written in my own hand, that the moment had arrived, not because I had been pushed, but because I had finally chosen to step forward. I did not raise my voice when I made the call, and I did not step outside or wait for privacy, because there was nothing secret about what I was doing, and that, I realized, was the difference between what they had been building and what I was about to set in motion. Theirs had been quiet out of avoidance, mine would be quiet out of certainty, and I sat at the small desk in the guest room with the door slightly open, the same way I had left it earlier, and I dialed the number slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel each step as it happened, to understand that this moment was not sudden. It was the result of everything that had led me here. And when the line connected, the voice on the other end was steady, professional, familiar in a way that felt grounding. And I spoke his name clearly, introducing myself without hesitation, and there was a brief pause before recognition settled into his tone, a shift that told me he remembered exactly who I was, not just as a name, but as part of something that had already been documented, prepared, and set aside for the right time. And I did not explain everything. I did not need to, because Edward had already done that years ago, and instead, I simply told him that I was ready, that the situation he had once outlined had now become real, and there was no urgency in his response, no surprise, only acknowledgement, as if he had been expecting this call not on a specific day, but eventually. And he asked me a few precise questions, not about emotions or details, but about timing, about access, about whether certain conditions had already been met, and I answered each one calmly, because by now, I understood exactly what those questions meant. And when I finished, he told me what would happen next, not in a dramatic way, not with promises or reassurances, but with clarity, outlining steps that had already been defined long before I needed them. And I listened without interrupting, my hand resting lightly on the desk, my fingers tracing the edge of the paper that lay beside me. And when the call ended, I did not feel relief, I did not feel triumph, I felt alignment, as if something that had been slightly out of place had finally been returned to its proper position. And I set the phone down, gently, taking a moment to sit in the quiet that followed, because outside the room, nothing had changed. The house continued as it had before, the same footsteps, the same voices, the same assumptions moving forward without interruption. And that, I realized, was exactly how it needed to be, because change does not always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it begins beneath the surface, invisible until it is too late to reverse. And I stood up slowly, smoothing my sleeve as I stepped into the hallway, my movements unhurried, my expression unchanged, because there was no reason to signal anything, no need to shift the atmosphere before it was necessary. And when I reached the kitchen, Rebecca was standing at the counter again, her phone in her hand, her attention divided between a message and whatever list she had been managing in her mind, and she looked up as I entered, offering the same small smile, asking if I needed anything, and I shook my head, moving past her to pour myself a glass of water, the simple action grounding me in the present moment. And Tyler was in the living room, his laptop open, his posture relaxed, as if the space around him had already been fully claimed, and I noticed how easily they both occupied the house now, how naturally they moved within it, and, for the first time, I understood that their confidence did not come from strength, it came from assumption, from the belief that nothing would challenge what they had set in motion. And I took a sip of water, setting the glass down carefully, because I knew that assumption was the one thing Edward had never relied on. And as I turned toward the hallway again, Rebecca spoke, her tone casual, asking if I would be home later that afternoon, mentioning something about needing to finalize a few things, and I paused just long enough to look at her, really look at her, not as the child I had raised, but as the person she had become, and I nodded once, telling her that I would be here, my voice steady, my expression calm, because that was the truth. I would be here, not waiting, not watching, but present, exactly where I needed to be when everything began to shift, and as I walked back toward the guest room, the house felt the same beneath my feet, the floorboards familiar, the air unchanged, but something within it had already moved, something subtle but irreversible, and I closed the door behind me once more, not to isolate myself but to prepare, because what came next would not require confrontation or explanation. It would simply unfold, one step at a time, exactly as it had been designed to do, long before anyone else in this house realized that the balance had already begun to return. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a quiet continuation of everything that had already begun, and I moved through it the same way I had the day before, calm, measured, present but not involved, because there was a difference now that only I could feel, a shift that had not yet reached the surface. And as I stepped into the kitchen, Rebecca was already there, standing at the counter with her laptop open, a stack of papers beside her, and Tyler was leaning against the doorway, speaking in low tones about something that sounded like timing again, about schedules, about making sure everything lined up the way they needed it to. And when they noticed me, their conversation paused, not abruptly, not suspiciously, just enough to signal that I had entered a space that was no longer entirely open to me, and Rebecca offered a brief smile before closing the laptop halfway, as if that small gesture could contain whatever had been visible only seconds before, and I poured myself a cup of coffee, using the same plain mug she had given me the day before, because I understood now that familiarity was no longer something I could rely on. And as I sat down at the table, I noticed the folder again, this time positioned closer to the edge, its contents slightly more visible, and I did not look directly at it, not because I was avoiding it, but because I no longer needed to confirm what I already knew, and instead, I focused on the rhythm of the moment, the way Rebecca's fingers tapped lightly against the table, the way Tyler checked his watch more than once, as if they were both waiting for something, though neither of them said it out loud, and I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch naturally between us, because silence, I had learned, reveals more than questions ever could, and after a few minutes Rebecca spoke, her tone controlled, almost rehearsed, explaining that someone might be coming by later, someone to look at a few things, though she did not specify what those things were, and I nodded once, not asking for clarification because the explanation itself was not meant for me, it was meant to justify something that had already been decided. And Tyler added a comment about making sure everything was ready, about wanting to keep things efficient, and I noticed how easily he spoke about the house as if it were his responsibility now, as if he had stepped into a role that had never been offered to him but had been quietly accepted anyway. And I set my cup down gently, my hands steady, my expression unchanged, because there was no need to challenge what they were building, not when I already knew it would not stand, and the rest of the morning passed in small movements, Rebecca moving from room to room, adjusting things, straightening surfaces that were already clean, checking details that did not require attention, while Tyler followed behind occasionally, offering suggestions, reinforcing decisions that had already been made, and I remained in the background, not hiding, not withdrawing, simply existing in a way that no longer disrupted their plans. And around mid-afternoon the doorbell rang, a single clear sound that seemed to carry more weight than it should have, and Rebecca moved quickly to answer it, her posture shifting slightly, her tone becoming more formal as she greeted the person on the other side. And I did not rush to see who it was, I did not stand or move closer, I simply listened, because I understood that what mattered was not who had arrived, but why. And footsteps followed. Unfamiliar ones, measured and deliberate, moving through the entryway into the living room, and I heard voices exchanging introductions, polite, professional, the kind that do not carry emotion but do carry purpose. And after a moment Rebecca called out, her voice directed toward me, asking if I could come into the living room for just a moment, and I stood up without hesitation, smoothing my sleeve as I walked down the hallway, my steps even, my pace unhurried, because I had been expecting this, not in detail but in direction. And when I entered the room, I saw a man standing near the center, holding a folder of his own, his posture straight, his expression neutral, and he turned toward me as I approached, his eyes settling on mine with a level of recognition that did not match a first meeting, and for a brief second, the room felt still, as if something unseen had just aligned, and Rebecca began to speak, introducing him in a tone that suggested this was a routine matter, something practical, something that required no concern. But before she could continue, the man spoke first, addressing me directly, his voice calm, respectful, and unmistakably certain, and in that moment I realized that whatever Rebecca had planned for this afternoon, whatever outcome she had been preparing for, was no longer entirely within her control, because the process she had set in motion had just intersected with something she had not accounted for. And I did not smile, I did not react outwardly, I simply met his gaze and nodded once, because everything that needed to be said had already been understood long before he stepped through that door. Rebecca's smile held for exactly 1 second too long before it shifted, not disappearing, but tightening at the edges in a way that only someone who had known her for decades would recognize, and she stepped slightly forward, positioning herself between me and the man as if she could still control the direction of what was about to happen, and she began again, her voice measured, introducing him as someone who was there to review some property details, using words that sounded neutral, almost routine, but carried a weight she did not fully understand, and the man nodded politely, acknowledging her introduction, but his attention remained on me, steady and deliberate, as if I were the only person in the room who mattered to the purpose of his visit, and for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and that silence, I realized, was not empty, it was transitional, the kind that exists just before something irreversible begins to take shape. And then he spoke again, addressing me by name, not formally, not casually, but with the exact tone of someone fulfilling a responsibility that had been defined long before this moment. And he asked if we could sit down, suggesting the dining table with a small gesture of his hand, and I nodded once, stepping forward without hesitation, because I understood that this was not an invitation, it was a continuation, and Rebecca hesitated for just a fraction of a second before following, her posture still composed, her expression still controlled, but her movements now slightly more deliberate, as if she were recalculating something she had already assumed was settled, and Tyler remained near the doorway, watching quietly, his earlier confidence softened into something more cautious, though he said nothing, and we all took our places at the table, the same table where so many ordinary moments had unfolded over the years, now holding something far less ordinary without changing its appearance at all, and the man placed his folder on the surface, opening it carefully, aligning the papers inside with precise movements that spoke of routine, of familiarity, of a process repeated many times before, and he began to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but with clarity, explaining that he was there to confirm certain arrangements that had been established previously, arrangements that were now being activated, and Rebecca leaned slightly forward, her brow tightening just enough to signal that this was not the script she had prepared for, and she asked a question, her tone polite but edged with confusion, asking what exactly he meant by previous arrangements, and the man turned his head slightly toward her, acknowledging her presence without shifting his focus entirely, and he explained that the property in question had been placed under a specific legal structure some time ago, one that outlined clear conditions regarding ownership, residency, and authority, and as he spoke, I could see the moment it began to register for her, not fully, not all at once, but in pieces, the way understanding often arrives when it contradicts expectation, and she glanced briefly in my direction, searching for something, perhaps confirmation, perhaps denial, but I did not provide either. I simply remained still, my hands resting lightly on the table, my expression unchanged, because this was not something that required explanation from me. It was already documented, already defined, already beyond interpretation, and Tyler shifted his weight slightly, his eyes moving between the two of us, trying to follow a conversation that was no longer as simple as he had assumed, and the man continued, his voice steady, outlining details that were precise, structured, and unmistakable in their implication, explaining that any changes to the property, including occupancy and intended transfers, required authorization from a designated party, and that party, he said clearly, had always been me, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, and Rebecca's posture changed almost imperceptibly, her shoulders drawing back, her expression tightening further as she processed what she was hearing, and she began to speak again, this time with less certainty, questioning the validity, the relevance, suggesting that circumstances had changed, that decisions had been made based on the current situation, but the man listened without interruption, and when she finished, he responded calmly, explaining that circumstances do not override established legal conditions, and that any actions taken without proper authorization could not be recognized as binding, and the room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different, heavier, more defined, because it no longer belonged to uncertainty, it belonged to realization, and I could see it in the way Rebecca's eyes shifted, in the way Tyler straightened slightly, as if adjusting to a new understanding of where he stood, and I did not move, I did not speak because there was nothing left for me to add. Everything that needed to be said was already present in the documents laid out on the table, in the structure Edward had put in place in the call I had made when I finally chose to step forward, and as I sat there, I realized that what had seemed like a quiet displacement, a gradual erasure of my place in this house, had never truly removed me at all. It had only revealed how easily they had mistaken silence for absence, and now that misunderstanding was beginning to correct itself, not through confrontation, not through emotion, but through something far more precise, something that did not raise its voice, did not demand attention, but simply existed with authority that could not be ignored. Rebecca opened her mouth as if to speak again, but no words came out this time, and that, more than anything, was what changed the atmosphere in the room, because until that moment she had always had something to say, something to explain, something to adjust or redirect, but now there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to reshape, and I watched as that realization settled into her posture, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small quiet shifts, the way her shoulders lowered slightly, the way her hands, which had been resting confidently on the table just minutes before, now moved closer together, fingers interlacing as if searching for something to hold onto, and Tyler remained still near the doorway, his earlier ease completely gone, replaced by a careful stillness that suggested he was no longer certain where he fit into what was happening, and the man across from us closed his folder with the same measured precision he had shown from the beginning, aligning the edges, placing his hand lightly on top of it as if signaling that everything necessary had already been presented, and he did not rush to leave. He did not stand or interrupt the silence, because he understood, as I did, that this moment was not about information, it was about acceptance, and acceptance cannot be forced. It arrives when there is nothing left to deny, and after a few seconds Rebecca finally spoke, her voice quieter now, less controlled, asking what exactly this meant moving forward, not in a confrontational way, but in a way that revealed she was beginning to understand that the direction of things had already changed, and the man responded calmly, explaining that no further action could be taken regarding the property without my direct authorization, that any previous attempts to modify occupancy or initiate transfers would need to be reviewed and, if necessary, reversed, and that all decisions moving forward would be subject to the structure already in place, and he spoke without emphasis, without judgment, simply stating what was already true, and I noticed how Rebecca listened this time, not interrupting, not reframing, just listening, because the space for reinterpretation had quietly closed, and when he finished, the room returned to silence once more, but this time it felt settled, not tense, not uncertain, just clear, and I took a slow breath, not because I needed to steady myself, but because I recognized that this was the moment where something internal needed to align with what had already been established externally, and I placed my hands flat on the table, not firmly, not forcefully, just enough to ground myself in the present, and I looked at Rebecca not with anger, not with accusation, but with the same calm clarity that had carried me through the past few days, and I spoke for the first time since the conversation had begun, my voice even, my words deliberate, telling her that nothing in this house had ever been meant to exclude her, that everything Edward and I had built was always intended to support our family, but that support did not mean surrender, and I paused briefly, not to create effect, but to choose the next words carefully, explaining that decisions about this home would be made with consideration, with fairness, but also with the understanding that it was not something that could be reassigned or redefined without my involvement, and I did not raise my voice, I did not emphasize any particular phrase, because I did not need to, the meaning was already clear, and Rebecca lowered her gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable, as if she were adjusting to a version of reality she had not prepared for, and Tyler shifted again, stepping slightly back as if instinctively recognizing that whatever role he had assumed here no longer applied in the same way, and the man stood then, closing his folder completely, offering a brief nod in my direction before turning toward the door, his presence already beginning to withdraw now that his purpose had been fulfilled, and Rebecca did not stop him, she did not follow, she simply remained seated, her hands still together, her posture still, and I watched as the door closed behind him, the sound soft, almost unremarkable, and yet it marked something final, something that had already been decided long before this afternoon, and I sat there for a moment longer, not waiting for a response, not expecting one, because this was not a conversation that required resolution in words. It had already resolved itself through structure, through preparation, through the quiet certainty that had been put in place years ago. And I stood up slowly, smoothing my sleeve as I stepped away from the table, moving toward the hallway with the same steady pace I had maintained from the beginning. And as I passed the staircase, I paused for just a second, looking up toward the room that had once been mine, not with longing, not with regret, but with understanding, because I knew now that what had been taken had never truly been lost. It had simply been waiting for me to remember that it was still mine to reclaim, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the simple act of standing where I had always belonged. And as I continued walking, the house felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because the balance within it had quietly returned, and for the first time since Edward was gone, I was not adjusting to the space around me, the space was adjusting back to me.